Accordingly it appears to reflection even ludicrous to be so anxious about this span of time, to tremble so much, if our own life or that of another is in danger, and to compose tragedies the horror of which has its strength in the fear of death. That powerful attachment to life is therefore irrational and blind. It can only be explained from the fact that our whole inner nature is itself will to live, to which, therefore, life must appear as the highest good, however embittered, short, and uncertain it may always be. And that will, in itself and originally, is unconscious and blind. Knowledge, on the contrary, far from being the source of that attachment to life, even works against it, for it discloses the worthlessness. When it conquers, and accordingly the man faces death courageously and composedly, this is honored as great and noble. Thus we hail then the triumph of knowledge over the blind will to live, which is yet the kernel of our own being. In the same way we despise him in whom knowledge is defeated in that conflict, and who therefore clings unconditionally to life, struggles to the utmost against approaching death, and receives it with despair. And yet in him, it is only the most original being of ourselves, and of nature that expresses itself. We may here ask, in passing, how could this boundless love of life, and endeavor to maintain it in every way, as long as possible be regarded as base, contemptible, and by the adherents of every religion as unworthy of this, if it were the gift of good gods, to be recognized with thankfulness? And how could it then seem great and noble to esteem it lightly? Meanwhile, what is confirmed by these considerations is 1. That the will to live is the inmost nature of man. 2. That in itself it is unconscious and blind. 3. That knowledge is an adventitious principle, which is originally foreign to the will. And 4. That knowledge conflicts with the will, and that our judgment applauds the victory of knowledge over the will. If what makes death seem so terrible to us were the thought of not being, we would necessarily think with equal horror of the time when as yet we were not. For it is irrefutably certain that not being after death cannot be different from not being before birth, and consequently is also no more deplorable. A whole eternity has run its course, while as yet we were not, but that by no means disturbs us. On the other hand, we find it hard, nay, unendurable, that after the momentary intermezzo of an ephemeral existence, a second eternity should follow in which we shall no longer be. Should, then, this thirst for existence have arisen, because we have now tasted it, and have found it so delightful? As was already briefly explained above, certainly not. Far sooner could the experience gained have awakened an infinite longing for the lost paradise of non-existence. To the hope, also, of the immortality of the soul there is always added that of a better world, a sign that the present world is not much good. Notwithstanding all this, the question as to our state after death has certainly been discussed, in books and verbally, 10,000 times oftener than the question as to our state before birth. Yet theoretically the one is just as near at hand, and as fair a problem as the other. And besides, whoever had answered the one would soon see to the bottom of the other. We have fine declamations about how shocking it would be to think that the mind of man, which embraces the world, and has so many very excellent thoughts, should sink with him into the grave. But we hear nothing about this mind, having allowed a whole eternity to pass before it came into being with these its qualities, and how the world must have had to do without it all that time. Yet no question presents itself more naturally to knowledge, uncorrupted by the will, than this. Infinite time has passed before my birth. What was I during this time? Metaphysically, it might perhaps be answered, I was always I, that is, all who during that time said I, were just I, but let us look away from this to our present entirely empirical point of view, and assume that I did not exist at all. Then I can console myself as to the infinite time after my death, when I shall not be, with the infinite time, when I already was not as a well accustomed, and indeed very, comfortable, state. For the eternity to come without me can be just as little fearful as the eternity that before was without me, since the two are distinguished by nothing, except by the interposition of an ephemeral dream of life. All proofs, also, for continued existence after death may just as well be applied in Partamanti, where they then demonstrate existence before life, in the assumption of which the Hindus and Buddhists therefore show themselves very consistent. Also, regarded entirely apart from these temporal considerations, it is in and for itself absurd to look upon not being as an evil. For every evil, as every good, presupposes existence, nay, even consciousness. But the latter ceases with life, as also in sleep, and in a swoon. Therefore the absence of it is well known to us, and trusted, as containing no evil at all. Its entrance, however, is always an affair of a moment. From this point of view Epicurus considered death, and therefore quite rightly said, death does not concern us. With the explanation, that when we are death is not, and when death is we are not. To have lost what cannot be missed, is clearly no evil. Therefore ceasing to be, ought to disturb us as little as not having been. Accordingly from the standpoint of knowledge there appears absolutely no reason to fear death. But consciousness consists in knowing, therefore, for consciousness death is no evil. Not this knowing part of us that fears death, but the fuga mortis proceeds entirely, and alone from the blind will. To this, however, as was already mentioned, it is essential, just because it is will to live, whose whole nature consists in the effort after life and existence, and which is not originally endowed with knowledge, but only in consequence of its objectification in animal individuals. If now the will, by means of knowledge, beholds death as the end of the phenomenon with which it has identified itself, and to which, therefore, it sees itself limited, its whole nature struggles against it with all its might. Whether now it has really something to fear from death we will investigate further on, and will then remember the real source of the fear of death, which has been shown here along with the requisite distinction of the willing and the knowing part of our nature. Corresponding to this, then, what makes death so terrible to us is not so much the end of life, for this can appear to no one specially worthy of regret, but rather the destruction of the organism. Really because the will itself exhibiting itself as body. But we only really feel this destruction in the evils of disease, or of old age. Death itself, on the other hand, consists for the subject only in the moment when consciousness vanishes, because the activity of the brain ceases. The extension of the stoppage to all the other parts of the organism, which follows this, is really already an event after death. Thus death, in a subjective regard, concerns the consciousness alone. Now what the vanishing of this may be everyone can to ascertain extent judge of from going to sleep. But it is still better known to whoever has really fainted, for in this the transition is not so gradual, nor accompanied by dreams, but first the power of sight leaves us, still fully conscious, and then immediately the most profound unconsciousness enters. The sensation that accompanies it, so far as it goes, is anything but disagreeable. And without doubt, as sleep is the brother of death, so the swoon is its twin brother. Even violent death cannot be painful, for even severe wounds are not felt at all till some time afterwards, often not till the outward signs of them are observed.